John hurried out of his workplace, his heart brimming with frustration. His partner had said something that deeply wounded him, and he couldn't dispel the anger. The more he pondered over it, the more distressed he became. He wandered through the avenues trying to clear his mind, but nothing seemed to alleviate his feelings. Hungry, John noticed a quaint cafe and decided to enter. He placed an order, hoping the meal would help him relax, but as he sat at the table gazing at his food, he realized he wasn't truly hungry. He took a few bites, but his thoughts kept returning to the disagreement with his partner. Why couldn't she understand him? Why did she always complicate things? He finished his meal, yet some food remained on his plate. Distracted by his thoughts, John stood up and exited the cafe, inadvertently leaving his wallet behind. His mind was too occupied to notice. Shortly after, a homeless young woman named Emily entered the cafe. She hadn't eaten in days, and the sight of the leftover food caught her eye. Extremely hungry and barely able to think of anything else, the aroma of the food was irresistible. Emily glanced around and saw that no one was paying attention. She quietly approached the table and sat down, her eyes fixed on the plate of food. She knew she shouldn't do this, but she was desperate. She reached for the food and began eating, hoping no one would notice her. Just as she took a bite, John returned to the cafe, having realized he had left his wallet and came back to retrieve it. When John saw Emily sitting at his table eating his food, he became angry. Without thinking, he shouted at her. "What are you doing? Are you stealing my food?" Emily was taken aback, she hadn't expected anyone to return. She looked up at John, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to steal. I was just so hungry." John didn't listen. His anger was too intense, and he couldn't see beyond it. "That's no excuse. You can't just take what doesn't belong to you. I haven't eaten in days." Emily tried to explain, "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just needed something to eat," but John wasn't interested in hearing her reasons. All he saw was someone taking his food without permission. He couldn't understand how someone could be so desperate. He told her to leave, his voice cold and harsh. Emily stood up, tears filling her eyes. She apologized again, but John didn't respond. He watched her walk out of the cafe, feeling nothing but anger about the situation. After she left, John sat back down at the table and picked up his wallet, but something felt off. Reflecting on what had just happened, a small part of him began to feel guilty. Maybe he had overreacted. Maybe he should have listened to her. But John was too proud to admit he might have been wrong. He tried to push the thought away, but the image of Emily's face stayed in his mind. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forget the look in her eyes when she said she was hungry. When John got home, he was still frustrated. His partner's words kept echoing in his mind. He picked up his phone and called her, thinking that maybe she had calmed down and they could resolve things. They were supposed to attend a grand event together the next day, and he didn't want any drama. The moment she answered, her tone was sharp. She wasn't interested in talking about the event or plans. Instead, she made a demand. She wanted a significant amount of money if she was going to attend the event with him. John was shocked. He had been generous with her before, always ensuring she had everything she needed, but now demanding money just to go to an event felt wrong. He asked why she needed the money, but she didn't provide a real reason. She only repeated her demand and hung up the call. Frustration built up inside him. He wasn't going to give in, there was no way he would pay just to have her by his side at the event. But now he had another problem, he couldn't attend alone. It wasn't the kind of event where you arrive without a companion. He needed someone with him, and he needed to figure it out quickly. Sitting in his living room, an idea popped into his head, Emily, the homeless girl. She may not have much, but he remembered how beautiful she was. Even with the dirt and struggles of living on the streets, her beauty shone through. If she could clean up a bit, she could easily be his date for the event. The idea seemed crazy at first, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The next morning, John got dressed and headed out, determined to find Emily. He wasn't sure if she would still be in the same place, but he had to try. He searched for a while, scanning the streets where he had last seen her. Eventually, he spotted her sitting on a corner where she often begged for money. Her face was tired, her clothes worn from life on the streets, but she was still there. As John approached, Emily noticed him. Her expression changed immediately. She looked angry, clearly remembering their last encounter. Her eyes narrowed as he got closer. There was no smile, no welcome. She didn't want to see him again after how he had treated her. John stood in front of her, knowing this wasn't going to be easy. He quickly apologized for the way he acted before, trying to explain that he had been upset and hadn't handled the situation well. Emily didn't care for his apology. Her eyes were still cold, filled with distrust. She asked him why he was there, clearly expecting nothing good. John took a breath and told her everything. He explained that his partner had refused to go to the event with him, and now he needed someone else to attend. He mentioned how beautiful Emily was and said that with a bit of preparation, she would be perfect for the occasion. The idea seemed ridiculous to Emily. She laughed, shaking her head. She couldn't believe he would even ask her after how he had yelled at her the other day. The idea of a homeless girl attending a fancy event seemed absurd at first. Emily refused outright. She wasn't interested in helping him, and she certainly didn't trust him after their last meeting. John could see he wasn't getting through to her, so he tried another approach. He told her he was willing to pay her, mentioning an amount, a sum so large that it made Emily stop for a moment. She hadn't expected that the money he was offering was more than she had ever dreamed of having. It would change her situation, at least for a while. It could get her off the streets, at least for a few days. It could buy her food, maybe even a place to stay for a little while. After a long pause, Emily finally agreed. She made it clear that she was only doing it for the money. This wasn't about helping John or being his date, it was business, nothing more. John nodded, relieved that she had agreed. The plan was in motion, and now all they had to do was get ready for the event. Emily stood in front of the mirror, amazed at her transformation. The dress John had bought for her was elegant, something she had never imagined wearing. Her hair was done up neatly, and her face looked radiant after a proper wash and some makeup. She hardly recognized herself. When John arrived to pick her up, he froze. The moment he saw her, he didn't say anything, just stared at her in disbelief. She looked stunning, more beautiful than he had even imagined. They arrived at the event, and as soon as they walked in, all eyes were on them. People whispered as Emily passed by, unable to believe that someone so gorgeous could have come with John. Emily, feeling the attention, held her head high. She wasn't used to such events, but she walked confidently, knowing she looked the part. Throughout the night, guests kept approaching John to ask who his stunning date was. He smiled, keeping the truth to himself, simply introducing her as Emily. Emily remained calm, polite, and charming, even though inside she still couldn't believe she was at a fancy event with people who seemed to have everything. The event ended, and as they walked out, John turned to Emily, thankful for how smoothly the night had gone. He knew that without her, it would have been a disaster. He pulled out the money he had promised her, a large sum, and handed it to her. Emily accepted the payment, knowing it was more than she had ever had before. She thanked him and walked away. John returned home, relieved the night was over. But as soon as he stepped through the door, his father was waiting for him. His father was an old-fashioned man, strict when it came to family matters. Without wasting any time, his father told him he needed to find a woman to marry. He made it clear that until John brought a woman home, he wouldn't hand over the family business to him. It was the condition he had set for John's inheritance. John was stunned. He had never expected his father to place such a demand on him. He knew his father was serious and that without a wife, he wouldn't get the business. But where would he find someone to marry so quickly? His mind raced, and then suddenly Emily's face came to mind. Without wasting any time, John picked up his phone and called Emily. She was surprised to hear from him so soon, thinking their arrangement was over. John quickly explained the situation. He needed her to pose as his fiancée, at least for a while. He offered her even more money than before, promising that she would be well taken care of. On top of that, he would rent an apartment for her so she wouldn't have to live on the streets anymore. Emily was quiet for a moment, thinking about his offer. It was tempting. She had just started to enjoy the idea of having money in her hands, and now John was offering even more. The thought of a place to live, no longer having to beg for food, was too good to turn down. She agreed to help him again. With their new deal in place, Emily prepared herself for the next step. John made sure she had everything she needed, from the rented apartment to the money she would be paid. All Emily had to do was show up and play her role. Days passed, and soon it was time for John to introduce Emily to his family. The weight of the situation hung heavily on his shoulders. If his father didn't believe the relationship, he could lose everything, the business, his position, his future. But he felt confident that Emily would do her part. Emily, now living in a comfortable apartment, carefully prepared for the meeting. She knew how important this was for John, but she also knew it was her chance to escape the streets for good. The money he promised could change her life forever. John arrived to pick her up, and once again, he couldn't help but be amazed by her transformation. She looked even more stunning than before, this time, more confident in her new life. Together, they headed to John's family home, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in their strange partnership. John and Emily arrived at the grand family estate. The house was imposing, with tall pillars and a manicured garden that stretched far beyond the gates. John glanced at Emily, unsure of how she was feeling. But as soon as they stepped out of the car, Emily straightened her posture and put on the confident smile she had practiced. The moment they walked into the house, John's father stood waiting in the grand living room. His eyes were sharp, sizing up Emily immediately. He had been skeptical when John mentioned he was bringing someone home, but now that the moment had come, he was curious to see who this mysterious woman was. Emily stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. She greeted John's father politely, her voice calm and poised. She spoke with just the right balance of confidence and humility, complimenting the home and expressing how honored she was to meet the family. Every word was carefully chosen, every gesture perfectly controlled. John's father watched her closely, but as Emily continued speaking, his skeptical expression softened. He listened intently as she answered his questions with intelligence and grace. Emily spoke about her background, carefully crafting a story that matched what John had told her. She didn't try too hard to impress, but her natural charm was undeniable. Before long, John's father was captivated by the way Emily carried herself, the way she spoke, it all seemed genuine. He had expected someone shallow or materialistic, but instead, he found a woman who seemed thoughtful and kind. He was impressed, something John hadn't seen in his father in a long time. By the end of the evening, John's father was completely taken with Emily. He even pulled John aside at one point, quietly telling him that Emily was exactly the kind of woman he had always hoped his son would marry. He praised her intelligence, her beauty, and most of all, her composure. John was relieved, though a bit surprised by how quickly things had turned in their favor. His father, who was often difficult to please, had fallen for Emily almost immediately. The pressure of the evening had lifted, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. Emily played her role perfectly throughout the night. She laughed at the right moments, complimented John's mother, and even shared a few stories that made John's father laugh, a rare sound in the household. By the time they were ready to leave, it was clear that Emily had left a lasting impression. As they drove away from the estate, John couldn't help but glance at Emily in the passenger seat. She had delivered far beyond what he had expected, and for the first time, he realized that she wasn't just some homeless girl playing a part. There was something deeper about her, something he hadn't seen before. When they arrived at Emily's apartment, John felt the need to clear the air. He looked at her seriously, thanking her for her help. He admitted that she had played her role perfectly and he couldn't have asked for more. But then, with a deep breath, he told her something she needed to hear. Though he appreciated her, he didn't love her. He was grateful for what she had done for him and his family, but there were no feelings between them. He wanted her to know that nothing romantic would come out of their arrangement, it was all just business. Emily was unbothered. She told him she didn't care. Love wasn't why she was doing this. As long as he kept paying her, that was all that mattered. She wasn't interested in romance, just the money. She had no feelings for him either, and she made that clear. For her, this was a temporary way to get out of the streets and nothing more. John nodded, feeling relieved that they were on the same page. He had been worried that things might get complicated, but Emily's calmness reassured him. They said their goodbyes, and Emily went inside her apartment while John drove home. A few days later, John's father called him. He wanted Emily to spend the weekend at the family house. His father had grown fond of her even more than John had expected. Emily had charmed him completely, and now he wanted to get to know her better. John felt a knot in his stomach, knowing that keeping this act up was becoming more complicated. But he had no choice, his father's approval was everything. When John told Emily about the invitation, she agreed without hesitation. More money and more time in a comfortable house were good enough reasons for her. She packed a small bag and made sure to look her best when John picked her up. As they arrived at the family estate, John's father greeted Emily with open arms. He was clearly thrilled to see her again, treating her like she was already part of the family. He showered her with compliments, telling her how much he admired her grace and intelligence. Emily smiled politely, keeping up the act. It was all going according to plan, and she was playing her part perfectly. But John's mother wasn't so easily convinced. From the moment Emily stepped through the door, her eyes followed her, watching every move. She was suspicious, though she couldn't explain why. Something about Emily didn't sit right with her. She felt like she had seen Emily before but couldn't place where. Beyond that, she didn't believe the story John had told them about how they met. It all felt too rushed, too convenient. As the weekend went on, John's father only grew more attached to Emily. He loved how well she spoke, how kind she was to everyone, and how she seemed to understand the family so well. He would pull John aside, praising Emily and telling him how lucky he was to have found such a wonderful woman. John forced a smile each time, knowing the truth but unable to say anything. Meanwhile, Emily did her best to blend in. She talked with John's father, laughed at his jokes, and charmed the other guests who visited during the weekend. But every time she looked over at John's mother, she could feel the coldness in her stare. The tension was undeniable. Later that night, when they were alone, Emily brought it up to John. She told him she didn't think his mother liked her. There was something in the way she looked at her, something off. John sighed, knowing his mother well. He assured Emily not to worry. His mother could be difficult sometimes, but this was all just temporary. They only had to keep up the act for a little longer, and once the business was his, everything would be fine. He promised Emily that he would find a perfect solution soon. Emily nodded, but she wasn't fully convinced. She knew John's mother was no fool. If she kept digging, it wouldn't be long before she uncovered the truth. But for now, she would stick to the plan. The money was too good to walk away from, and she had already come too far. The weekend ended with John's father more convinced than ever that Emily was the right woman for his son. He even began talking about wedding plans, telling John that he couldn't wait to see them married and start a family. John, trapped by his own lies, could only smile and nod, knowing he was running out of time to come up with a better solution. As they drove back to Emily's apartment, the weight of the situation began to press on John. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. His father was expecting a marriage, his mother was growing more suspicious, and Emily, though playing her part, wasn't someone he could truly rely on for the long term. He needed to figure out what to do before everything spiraled out of control. Meanwhile, Emily was already counting the money in her head, wondering just how much more she could get out of this arrangement before it all came crashing down. Sarah, John's partner, had grown suspicious of John over the past few weeks. He had been distant, not answering her calls like before, and his excuses for missing their usual dates were getting more ridiculous. She knew something was off. After hearing that John had been spending time with Emily, she decided to investigate. It didn't take long for her to find out that Emily was the same homeless girl John had shouted at in the street weeks earlier. The pieces of the puzzle began to come together, and Sarah realized that John and Emily had planned the whole thing. Angry and feeling betrayed, Sarah went straight to Emily's apartment. She knocked on the door, and when Emily opened it, she was met with Sarah's fury. Without holding back, Sarah told Emily to leave John alone. She claimed that John was her boyfriend, not Emily's, and that Emily had no right to be with him. Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at Sarah with a smirk, as if she found the whole situation amusing. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and listened to Sarah's rant. When Sarah finished, Emily simply shrugged and told her that she wasn't going anywhere. She insulted Sarah, calling her desperate and pathetic for clinging to a man who clearly wasn't interested in her anymore. Emily reminded Sarah that she was the one John had chosen to bring home, not Sarah. Sarah, embarrassed and humiliated, had no choice but to leave. She had come expecting to scare Emily away, but instead, she left feeling defeated. However, she wasn't ready to give up. As soon as she got home, she came up with a new plan. If she couldn't get rid of Emily directly, she would use John's mother to do the job. The next morning, Sarah called John's mother. She told her everything, how John and Emily had lied about their relationship, how Emily was really a homeless orphan, and how the entire thing had been a plan to win over John's father. She emphasized that Emily was from a poor background, a fact she knew would upset John's mother more than anything else. When John's mother heard the news, she was furious. The thought of her son marrying someone from such a background disgusted her. She had always believed that John should marry someone from a wealthy family, someone who came from the same high social standing as theirs. Poor people, in her eyes, were beneath them. She felt they could never understand the life her family lived, and she certainly didn't want her son to be tied to someone like Emily. Her mind raced with anger and disappointment. How could John have lied to them all? How could he even consider marrying a girl from the streets? The more she thought about it, the more her anger grew. She had never liked Emily from the start. Sensing that something was off now with this new information, her suspicions were confirmed. John's mother sat in her luxurious living room, gripping the phone tightly as Sarah continued to spill details about Emily's past. By the end of the conversation, she had made up her mind. She was not going to let her son marry a poor girl like Emily, no matter what. To her, this wasn't just about love or feelings, it was about protecting the family's status and legacy. Sarah hung up the phone, feeling satisfied. She knew John's mother would handle Emily from here. In her mind, it was only a matter of time before Emily was out of the picture and John would come back to her where he belonged. Meanwhile, John's mother wasted no time. She began plotting how to confront her son and expose the truth about Emily to the rest of the family. In her eyes, John's decision to be with Emily was nothing more than a foolish mistake, and she was determined to correct it. The idea of her son being tied to a poor orphan was unbearable. John was sitting in his office when his mother barged in, her face full of anger. She didn't waste any time. She confronted him about Emily. The moment she started speaking, John knew Sarah had told her everything. His mother was furious. She demanded to know why he had lied to the family and how he could even think about marrying a homeless orphan. John, realizing he was caught, quickly stood up and tried to calm her down. He begged her not to tell his father about any of this. He explained that it was all just a plan, something he had come up with to get his father's approval. He assured her that he didn't have any real feelings for Emily and that once the business was handed over to him, Emily would be gone. He promised it was just an act to fool his father, nothing more. But his mother wasn't convinced. She told him she didn't believe him. She had seen the way he looked at Emily, noticed how much time they were spending together, how his eyes softened when she was around. There was no way this was just an act. His mother was sure that he had feelings for Emily, even if he didn't want to admit it. John tried to deny it, but his mother shook her head. She was too smart for that. She reminded him of how much the family had invested in his future. She didn't raise him to marry someone from the streets, someone without family money or status. She wasn't about to let all their hard work go to waste because of some girl. His father would never agree to this. Once he found out the truth, John sighed, feeling trapped. He knew his mother wouldn't let this go easily, but he also knew that Emily wasn't someone he could simply get rid of right now. She was a key part of his plan, and if his father found out the truth, everything would fall apart. As his mother left the room, John sat down, his mind racing. He needed to figure out what to do before things got out of hand. The plan had worked so far, but now it was starting to unravel. When John's mother got home, her anger was written all over her face. She stormed into the living room where John's father was sitting, reading the newspaper. Without waiting, she told him everything about Emily's past, how John had lied to the family and how he had deceived them into thinking he was in a serious relationship with her. She expected her husband to be just as furious, maybe even more. But to her surprise, he simply put down the paper, looked at her, and calmly replied that he didn't mind. John's mother blinked in disbelief. She couldn't understand how her husband could be so calm about the situation. He explained that he had already grown fond of Emily. He didn't care about her being poor, in fact, he liked Emily's humble background. What truly mattered to him was that she was a kind and respectful young woman. The only thing that disappointed him was John's dishonesty. He was upset that John had lied about his relationship with Emily, pretending it was something more serious than it really was. Apart from that, he had no issue with Emily at all. John's mother stood there, speechless. She had expected her husband to share her anger, but instead, he was perfectly fine with everything. After a moment, she sat down, trying to process what he had said. John's father picked up the phone and called John, asking him to come over. When John arrived, he looked tense, knowing this was likely about Emily. He sat down in front of his parents, ready for what was to come. But to his surprise, his father spoke calmly. He admitted that he was hurt by the lie, but he wanted to know the truth. John hesitated for a moment, then he confessed. He told them that at first, he hadn't liked Emily, the whole thing had been part of his plan to win his father's approval and secure the business. But over time, something had changed. The more time he spent with Emily, the more he realized how special she was. He had been afraid to admit it, but now he was in love with her. He didn't know how to tell her, especially after everything that had happened. John's father smiled and told John that he should go ahead and tell Emily how he truly felt. He reminded John that sometimes the most unexpected people could change your life. He encouraged him to take the chance, saying that Emily might feel the same way. John was surprised by his father's support and decided to follow his advice. The next day, John went to see Emily. His heart was racing as he approached her apartment. He wasn't sure how she would react, but he knew he couldn't hide his feelings any longer. When Emily opened the door, John felt nervous. He sat down and, after taking a deep breath, told her everything. He explained how he had fallen in love with her, how he didn't expect it, and how much she meant to him. Emily listened quietly, and when John finished, she smiled to his surprise. She told him that she had loved him too. From the day they went to the event together, she had been waiting for him to say something but didn't want to push him. Hearing her say that filled John with joy. Right then and there, John proposed to Emily, and without hesitation, she accepted. They both felt a wave of happiness wash over them, knowing that their love was real. Meanwhile, Sarah was still determined to ruin things for John and Emily. When she heard about John's proposal, she couldn't believe it. Furious, she went to see John's mother again, hoping to turn her against Emily one last time. Sarah ranted about how Emily wasn't good enough for John, how she was just a poor orphan who didn't belong in their family. But this time, John's mother wasn't moved by her words. Instead, she looked Sarah in the eye and told her that she wanted the best for her son. Right now, the best thing for John was Emily. She had seen how happy Emily made John, how his face lit up when she was around. Emily had won her over, and now she was fully supportive of their relationship. Sarah was stunned and humiliated. She had no choice but to leave a week later, unable to bear the shame of losing John and her failed attempts to destroy his happiness. Sarah packed her bags and left the country. She couldn't handle the embarrassment of being replaced by Emily, someone she thought was far beneath her. Sarah boarded a plane and left for Europe, where she hoped to start over. But deep inside, she was filled with regret. She had tried everything to win John back, but nothing had worked. Now she was forced to accept defeat, leaving in disgrace. With Sarah gone, John and Emily's life became more peaceful. The tension that had surrounded their relationship slowly faded. 2 months later, after much planning and preparation, John and Emily stood before their family and close friends as they exchanged vows. The wedding was a beautiful, intimate ceremony held at the family's estate. Emily, wearing a simple yet elegant white dress, looked radiant. John couldn't take his eyes off her the entire time, still amazed by how far they had come. The man who once saw Emily as just part of his plan was now standing beside her, deeply in love as they exchanged their vows. Emily's heart swelled with emotion. She had never imagined her life would take this turn, from being homeless on the streets to standing in front of John, surrounded by love and acceptance. It all felt like a dream. John, too, was overwhelmed by how much he had changed. He never thought he would fall in love with someone so different from what he had envisioned, yet Emily had become everything he didn't know he needed. After the ceremony, as they danced under the twinkling lights, John's father raised a toast. He praised Emily for her grace and resilience and welcomed her into the family wholeheartedly. His speech touched everyone, even bringing a tear to John's mother's eye. Despite her earlier reservations, she had come to see Emily's true worth. She was no longer concerned with Emily's past or her background. What mattered now was the future they were all building together. As the night wore on, John and Emily found a quiet moment alone, sitting together and watching the stars. John took her hand and smiled. He told her how much he appreciated her, how grateful he was that she had entered his life. Emily smiled back, her heart full. She told him that no matter what, she would always be there for him, just as he had been for her. They both knew they had faced challenges, but they were stronger for it. In the weeks that followed, John's father officially handed over the business to him, with Emily by his side. John felt ready to take on the responsibility together. They started making plans for the future, both for their business and their personal lives. Emily, who had once struggled just to survive, was now helping John with his work, bringing her own insights and ideas. She became more than just his wife, she was his partner in every sense of the word. Dear viewers, what lessons did you take away from this dramatic tale? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, give us a thumbs up, share it with friends, and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest updates. Thanks for watching, and stay blessed.